What will the Denver Broncos defensive scheme look like in 2022, and how similar is it to Vic Fangio's defense with Ejiro Evero? Patrick Surtain and Draymond Jones share their thoughts in a media scrum. Plus, Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we talk about when the Broncos are on the clock at pick number 64. What would be a surprise pick at this point for this Broncos team? Which positions? We take a look at that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked on NFL Network, your team every day. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. Both of us, we cover the Denver Broncos for the Locked on Network and 9 News. Broncos Country, thank you so much for making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, whether it's on your favorite audio podcasting platform or whether it's here in video format on YouTube. Regardless, make sure if you're not doing so already, you hit that subscribe and that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. And for the YouTube algorithm, if you're watching this right now, make sure you smash that like button for the algorithm, comment as well, and interact with us as we go about on today's episode of the show. Sayre, hey, look, Broncos media sessions building up before the NFL draft. We know that this Friday we will hear from Broncos GM George Paton, his pre-draft press conference. Excited to see maybe what we can get out of that from him. But, focusing on Patrick Surtain and Draymond Jones, they met with the media in Dove Valley on Tuesday at the UC Health Training Center. And a lot of questions came up about the Broncos defensive scheme under Ejiro Evero. What does that look like for the team, man? I can't wait to break all that down. Plus some surprise picks that Broncos fans maybe would be shocked if they chose certain positions with pick number 64. Can't wait to break it down with you, my man.
I can't wait, Cody. And speaking of surprise picks, wasn't it just about a year ago, Patrick Surtain himself was kind of a surprise pick for a lot of people in Broncos country. It was even tweeted out by a couple of different people that the Broncos were going to take Justin Fields. And I know that was kind of the direction that everybody thought they were going to go, because of just the nature of how everything felt. Like, I don't think a lot of people actually thought Fields would be there at 9, and then you take Patrick Surtain, and everybody's like, why would you do that? You just signed Kyle Fuller, and you just brought in Ronald Darby, and you got Ojemudia and Bryce Callahan. But here we are a year later, and Patrick Surtain is one of the leaders of the team, taking the podium at OTAs. And doesn't he just look rocked up? Man, that guy is big. He is a big cornerback, and I love it, man. It's so great to have him on the team. I think now that I have my Russell Wilson jerseys, Cody, I think a number 2 Surtain has to be next on the list, right there with Justin Simmons. I know you got a nice little piece in recently, so I think the people need to see. Look at that.
Signed too. That's got to go on my jersey shelf. So yes,
that's good.
Damn, there we go.
Glorious.
A good old PS2 fan. But I'm glad you made those points here too, because for him, I think for him as a rookie, and we're going to do an episode later on throughout this offseason, the expectations for PS2 going into year 2. Looking back on that pick, Sayre, I think it was the best pick for the Broncos in hindsight with everything that's transpired. The idea to bring him in to be the guy that's going to stop, guys like Tyreek Hill. And what does he do? He holds Tyreek Hill to one of his lowest outputs of his career. That's exactly why you went and you got Patrick Surtain II with the 9th overall pick here. But a lot of questions, about, what are your expectations for yourself in year 2? And he's like, hey, just continue to grow as a player. And another question that was brought up was, what does this scheme look like under Ejiro Evero in comparison to last year's scheme, which was obviously under Vic Fangio? And basically, he and Draymond Jones had the same answer. He said, essentially, it is the same exact scheme, and it's got its own different twist, right? Because Ejiro Evero will be a different defensive coordinator than Vic Fangio. There's going to be some things that they do, but obviously I think one thing that was mentioned by Draymond is the terminology of this defense is much more simpler. Like, there's a lot of terminology, but it's simpler. When you say one thing, you know exactly what you're going to be doing. So I think that last year's defense was very complicated, and we've heard this from various players. Vic Fangio's defense is not easy to learn. So the fact that you can have the same system, you can bring kind of that continuity back with the scheme, but then make it simpler for the players with simplified terminology that changes based on formation and also like what sets, an offense comes out, what personnel offense comes out in, changes a lot. And I think it makes it easier for the players. They don't have to think as much before the snap, which there were times last year, according to some players I talked to, there were some things that, sometimes the play was not getting put in until the last second, which put the Broncos in a tough spot there.
Well, and we even saw a couple of communication errors between some of the quote unquote smartest or most veteran players on the team, right? The communication between the corners and the safeties at times last year was a bit off. So I think we know from history speaking and just looking back to even when the Broncos were in the process of hiring Vic Fangio or interviewing him, even that was a lot of what people talked about in Chicago, is that it's a tough defense to pick up on, which is why I think when guys were healthy, you really saw the majority of the starters play the majority of the snaps throughout the course of the season, because those guys needed to be tight in their communication. I love the idea of simplifying the terminology and allowing more and more players to come in and really be able to contribute early on. I think this is a huge factor, what you just brought up, for young players, which we assume the Broncos will have plenty of an influx of new players coming in here with the draft. And then obviously, just some of the young players that are kind of holdovers from last year, Caden Stearns being another guy, Jamar Johnson. You want to see Baron Browning be able to play at a high level this season. So there's a number of young players on the defensive side that I think simplifying terminology is great. And it's great to see Draymond Jones once again at the podium, Cody. And I'll have to say, I mean, he also looks absolutely jacked.
Yeah, he
And you
does.
love to see it. He's a big guy, but it's like a lot of defensive linemen, they're like thicker, but Draymond Jones just looks like he's just a rocked up. He doesn't look like he has an ounce of fat on him. These guys, the old cliche this time of year is, I'm in the best shape of my life. But man, these guys are in really good shape, and it's great to hear about just how they've been learning the new system and the new terminology. And for Patrick Surtain, I really love that he talked about how much he's learning from guys like Kareem Jackson and Justin Simmons, because I think absorbing from those veteran players is just as crucial at this time of year. And even last year as a rookie, I'm sure that really helped him grow and develop as a young corner in the NFL.
I mean, those things are super important for any young player. For a guy like Patrick Surtain, who played for a prolific program like Alabama, started as a true freshman and was able to grow along the way. He's kind of been a pro for like the last 3 years of his playing career. And obviously for him, taking that next step, becoming a leader, I think is huge. And one thing they even mentioned too about the Broncos' new defense coordinator, Giro Evero, is that he is super energetic, which look, it makes it very fun for players to be around. Like they all know, like, hey, when we're on the field, there's a time to flip the switch and be serious. But he's also one of those coaches that gets down with them, has fun with them, which I think is important. You didn't necessarily get a lot of that from Vic Fangio. Like it was crazy that it was the Dallas Cowboys game where we saw really any emotion from Vic Fangio on fourth down after they stopped him. That was the only emotion I think we've ever seen from Vic when it comes to the defense making a play. And I'm not sure what kind of prompted that, but it's like you have a coach now that has always been energetic, and now he will be very energetic. He'll celebrate with you when you make big plays. Players love nothing more than that. But you know what, Sayre, as we approach the NFL draft, there's a lot of questions with what the Denver Broncos will do when pick number 64 happens, when they are on the clock. We talk about what surprise positions could Denver take at 64 that Broncos can be like, whoa, I didn't see this coming. We debate all those coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about Blue Nile, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And BlueNile.com has fine jewelry options for every mom. You can shop high quality, classic diamond earrings, elegant tennis bracelets, or gemstone pendant necklaces at BlueNile.com. If you are looking for fine jewelry but have trouble choosing, Blue Nile has a jewelry expert on hand 24/7, available by phone or chat to help you find a memorable gift at every budget. And you can celebrate life's special moments with fine jewelry today, and you can mark Mother's Day on your calendar with something enduring. Classic diamond stud earrings, elegant tennis bracelets, and like I said, birthstone pendants, and much more. BlueNile.com. This Mother's Day, give mom something that she'll treasure forever with fine jewelry from BlueNile.com, and Locked On Sports listeners can get $50 off of $500. This podcast exclusive is only good through Mother's Day. Use code Locked On. That's one word, Locked On. That's code Locked On. Plus, every order is insured and ships free and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shop stress-free and find your forever peace. Go to BlueNile.com today. As we jump into the second half action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, both Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we're going to get into some surprise positions that the Denver Broncos could choose with their top pick in this year's NFL draft. But before we do that, we just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. And if you're not doing that already, you need to. Here's why. Because every single day when you wake up, you have your morning cup of coffee, breakfast, you go on a workout, or you're on your way to work. Let us guide you there with daily Denver Broncos news, content coverage in 30 minutes or less here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Thank you so much. Make sure you subscribe, smash that like button as well, and follow on your favorite audio podcasting platform. Sayre, let's get into a conversation because a little bit ago, you and I were talking about the expectations for the Broncos in the 2021 NFL Draft, that at number 9, nobody had thought that they were going to pick Patrick Surtain II, and it was a huge surprise to many in Broncos country. Could George Paton possibly do the same thing to Broncos country this year when the Broncos are on the clock with pick number 64 here? What if they went with a wide receiver at pick number 64? Let's dive into the possibilities as to maybe why this could be a surprise option for the Broncos.
Well, I like this possibility, Cody, and I know we dedicated a lot of the Javonte Williams episode to talking about the possibility of a running back potentially with one of those top picks, and I think that still remains, but since we already talked about that, I think wide receiver is probably the number one position that would most surprise a lot of Broncos fans, because you look at the roster right now, and I think a lot of us would say the same thing this year, what we said about the cornerback position last year. Doesn't really need much attention, doesn't really need a starter. There's other positions that need starter attention, but the wide receiver position is a premium position in today's NFL. You look across the entire league, every different position group, and what are the positions that are the most highly paid? That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a premium position. Well, we've got the quarterback position locked down, right? So the other premium positions would be wide receiver, offensive tackle, edge rusher, and then cornerback. Those are the premier positions in today's NFL that are getting paid the most amount of money in terms of just the top end players. And so those are the position groups that you want to invest your high draft choices in to get the best talent possible, so that if a guy wants to go get paid $20-25 million a year at the wide receiver position, you've got somebody in place. So if a wide receiver ends up being the best player on the board at pick number 64, or if somebody drops into the 50s, I wouldn't be surprised to see the Broncos move up, even with the guys they already have on the roster.
Well, you mentioned guys, too, in more recent NFL drafts for the Broncos. Tyree Cleveland is on that list. He's still on the active roster right now, but there's Jerry Jeudy and KJ Hamler. Obviously, first and second round picks here. For George Paton, I think this is something that Broncos country, even though it's very unlikely, I think Broncos fans need to maybe consider. Like, George Paton did not draft Jerry Jeudy or KJ Hamler. I think he recognized the talent, the potential that they have, but this is going to be a very big year. And also, I think for George Paton, is there any solidarity? Are there any questions right now at wide receiver in his mind with any of these guys? And if there is the case in that, we could see George Paton, like you said, select wide receiver. How likely is it to happen? I mean, I feel like it's a long shot at this point, but then again, nothing would surprise me anymore in the National Football League. And then you look at, obviously, the extensions that George Paton made with Tim Patrick and Courtland Sutton. Next season, Tim Patrick will carry a $12 million cap hit next season. He counts against $12 million against the cap, and then his dead cap, if released, would be around $2 million. I don't think that the Broncos would release Tim Patrick, but there's so many things that are going on in my head right now, Sarah. I'm trying to picture with what we've seen this offseason with other teams and the deals that they've given wide receivers. I mean, there could be a possibility Denver wants to go with the cheaper route, but I think a lot will depend on how Russell Wilson feels about these guys.
It really does. And last year is a prime example of exactly why you might see the Broncos make this selection, because wide receiver is so critically important. Remember, all these Twitter people that are jumping into our mentions are talking about how Russell Wilson doesn't like to throw over the middle of the field or doesn't utilize the tight end as often. Well, if that's the case, it strengthens the argument for more wide receivers. And the Broncos last year, they were without Jerry Jeudy for a decent stretch of the season. They were without KJ Hamler for most of the season. Obviously, 2 years ago, Courtland Sutton, the torn ACL. Then, Tim Patrick has been durable in the NFL thus far, but he does have a pretty lengthy injury history dating back to his days at college when he actually miraculously overcame a leg injury. To be able to even play right now is crazy for him. Google that story if you don't know about it at this point. But just injury factor, and not that you draft because you're worried about somebody getting injured, but you draft a wide receiver at 64 potentially, not just to be, we're going to draft a wide receiver because our roster is so good and we can do whatever we want. No, it's a premium position. It's a position that you're likely going to need, to use that player at some point in the year. And then next year, it frees up your options. Look, the Broncos don't have a first or second round pick in the 2023 NFL draft. Say you have an overabundance of receivers and you're able to parlay one of those players for a pick in the first, in the top 64, the top 50. I think that's something you have to consider at this point. Drafting a wide receiver in 2022 may be as good as trading that number 64 pick for a future first or second round pick.
Well, the Broncos are on the clock at pick number 64. Another surprise position, safety here for the Denver Broncos. We have that listed here. Now, obviously, for the Kareem Jackson re-signing, that's huge for them. But will the Broncos, would we be shocked if they went out and got a safety at pick number 64 in this year's NFL draft?
Well, I think it would be a bit of a surprise, right? At least a little bit, just based on the fact that you got Caden Stearns, you got Jamar Johnson, you signed J.R. Reed in free agency. Now you brought back Kareem Jackson, Justin Simmons obviously getting the long-term deal. So it would be a bit of a surprise. But I think that the position strength at safety in this year's draft is really good. It's a very good class. A lot of guys with that high RAS score. We talk about that a lot on this podcast because it's so important to George Paton and his draft process. So you look at the safety class, a lot of times off-ball linebackers, safeties, running backs, those types of positions fall into the second round or a little bit later than they otherwise should. So you might get yourself a starting safety, a long-term starting safety at pick number 64 with an outstanding athletic profile in a deep class like this. I think there's some really good players the Broncos will have to pick from there at 64.
Well, Broncos Country, let us know down below in the comment section here on YouTube, or tweet us on Twitter at Lockdown Broncos, at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, your thoughts on what you would be surprised about if the Broncos went with a wide receiver or a safety in the 2022 NFL Draft at pick number 64. We're going to continue this conversation with a couple of other surprising positions where Broncos Country will be like, whoa, why did they go at this position? We talk about that much more coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about Built Bar, the other sponsor of today's episode, Locked on Broncos. And Built Bar is the first string quarterback, QB1 of all protein bars. And if you need a little bit of a pick-me-up, Built Bar is perfect for it because each bar of Built Bar contains 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. Not to mention they have 9 amazing original flavors, plus the occasional limited time offers like the puffs. You can check out the wide assortment of flavors that come out on a monthly basis at built.com. Find a flavor for you or your family today, or get a mix box of 18 Built Bars with 9 different flavors sent directly to your doorstep. And when you go to built.com and you go to checkout, make sure you enter promo code LOCK15, and that'll get you 15% off your next order at built.com. Once again, promo code LOCK15 gets you 15% off at built.com. And as we get into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in to today's episode of the show, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Don't forget, beginning next week, the Locked On NFL live draft show kicks off on April 28th, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on the Locked On NFL YouTube channel. The local experts on the biggest stories with draft coverage. Be sure to tune in and check that out here today. Not to mention, all throughout this week and next week, you have the Locked On NFL Network and Odyssey partnering up for the ultimate Locked On NFL mock draft. Be sure to check it out when the Broncos are on the clock at 64. Who would be an ideal pick for them? Sayre and I, we give our selection. You're going to have to wait and tune in on the Locked On Ultimate NFL mock draft. Free and available everywhere you get your podcast. Sayre, kind of continuing on with our conversation here today about some surprise positions that maybe if the Broncos chose them at pick number 64, everybody in Broncos Country would be like, wait a minute, why was this the pick? Why was this the position here? Let's start off now. We talked about wide receiver. We talked about safety. Let's go with the center position or interior offensive line. Why might this be a surprise to Broncos Country if, in fact, they decide to do just that?
Well, I think it would be at least a bit of a surprise just because a lot of the fan base absolutely loves Dalton Risner, and we all love Dalton Risner. He's an amazing guy, local product. Obviously, everybody really wanted him in the 2019 NFL Draft. When the Broncos got him, it was very exciting. Probably the most excited a fan base has been about a guard selection in a long time,
Yeah.
Cody. But it was great to get to pick him. But is his spot solidified after 2 kind of down years for him? He was solid in his rookie season, and I think showed promise. After a down couple of seasons in a row, do the Broncos consider making a move there? Or with Lloyd Cushenberry, I think he got off to a really rough start as a rookie in 2020. Then in 2021, he made some progress, but there was still some issues with interior pressure being given up. So I think that center and left guard position, to me, I don't think you can say definitively that those are set in stone. Graham Glasgow is back this year. Quinn Minor's probably going to be taking that right guard position. So I think right now I sense some uncertainty at left guard and center from the Denver Broncos, and they've kind of reflected that by bringing in the majority of their top 30 visits, Cody, of players that are considered maybe realistically available with their top selections at 64, 75, and then 96. The only guys that they've brought in with that range, not necessarily the only ones, but the majority of guys in that range, they have been interior linemen and centers. So it's very interesting to see kind of maybe is that the direction they're going? Are they bringing in these players on the interior offensive line to sort of differentiate which guy they like the best? I wouldn't be surprised to see somebody like Cam Jurgens. Maybe if he falls out of round one, do you trade up for Tyler Linderbaum, my guy out of Iowa, you know? So I think interior offensive line would surprise some people at pick number 64 just because it's not the glamorous position, but it's certainly one that you could see the Broncos going after based on a little uncertainty there.
Well, let's talk about the interior of the defensive line right now. Now, obviously, we heard from Draymond Jones on Tuesday at the UCL Training Center, and he talked about really what he feels like, because he was asked a question about, what do you think DJ Jones can bring to the defense to help make you better? And he's like, well, look, I think DJ can bring something. I think that Mike, I think Sosa, I think Marquise, I think all these other guys that he named, he said, can help make me better, and I can help make them better. I mean, would we be surprised at this point if the Broncos do look at maybe a replacement on the interior defensive line? I mean, Mike Purcell a couple of years ago had signed a contract extension. For him, I think his biggest issue has been battling some injuries in the last couple of years that have really impacted him staying on the field or sometimes impacting the effectiveness. Like when he's fully healthy, he's effective. But when he is banged up, or like I said, the thing he was dealing with the thumb last year, that was a huge injury. And then a couple years ago was the Liz Frank injury that he had dealt with on his foot that required some recovery. Could the Broncos maybe look for an eventual future replacement for Mike Purcell? And look, I'm a big Mike Purcell guy. I love his story. I had a chance to chat with him last offseason about his journey to the NFL and obviously making it to the Denver Broncos and being extended. But, at this point too, it's like this is George Paton's team now. George Paton doesn't necessarily have an allegiance to any guys that have signed former contracts from the previous regime. And obviously John Elway took care of Purcell. Could that change though? Could they be looking to the future here at pick number 64?
I think they could. I really do. I mean, Draymond Jones also entering a contract year, and you figure the Broncos will find a way to keep him back. He's probably due for an extension at some point. I would love to see George Paton get that deal done sooner rather than later, just because that price is only going to keep going up. But I do think, with Draymond Jones' contract coming up, Mike Purcell kind of in that space of like, are the Broncos even going to keep him after the draft, depending on what transpires? Are they going to go after some notable free agents that are still left, which there's a lot of them on the interior defensive line? Even though you added DJ Jones to the mix there, I feel like there's just a lot of uncertainty. Like, what happens if Draymond gets injured? What happens if DJ Jones gets injured? And not that you don't necessarily draft for fear of injury, but you have to draft with the future in mind, the potential that kind of a thing could happen. So I think on this list that we put together, maybe interior defensive line would be the least surprising of the surprising positions, just based on where the Broncos roster is at right now. But I do think that it's a very legitimate possibility at 64. A lot of the mock draft simulations still have Travis Jones, the defensive lineman from UConn, sitting there at 64. I don't think there's any chance that's happening, but I guess crazier things have happened. And this is a pretty decent defensive line draft in terms of the depth of the class. The top end talent, maybe not quite there, but the depth of the class is pretty solid. So I think we could see the Broncos going that direction if the right guy falls to pick 64.
Well, Broncos Country, let us know your thoughts down below. Which position would be the most surprise pick for you for the Denver Broncos if they chose them at pick number 64 in the 2022 NFL Draft? Is it wide receiver? Is it safety? Is it interior O-line? Is it defensive line on the interior? Let us know your thoughts on what the most surprising pick would be, and in your eyes, what you would likely do in that situation in our YouTube comment section or on Twitter at Locked On Broncos, at Sayre Bedinger, at Cody Roark, NFL. But that will wrap up today's episode, Locked On Broncos, throughout this week and going into next week, especially building up towards the NFL Draft. Sayre Bedinger and myself, we will do our final mock draft on Monday, our final mock building up to maybe what the Broncos can do. We'll see how the board falls, if there's any changes, and we'll have a lot more insight as well. Plus, some expectation series continues on various players. Not to mention, George Paton has his pre-draft press conference on Friday, and we're going to do an interactive segment with you, the members in Broncos Country, on our Broncos Twitter community, where if you could ask George Paton a question in his pre-draft press conference, what question would you ask him? Make sure you get those in on our community page. Make sure you find the tweet and you get your answers in. We'll share it here on the show. But with that said, that will wrap up today's episode. Lockdown Broncos here on your favorite podcast and provider, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts, here on YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe button or follow us if you haven't done so already. And make sure you stay tuned every single day here, Lockdown Broncos, because Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we break it down from an objective point of view, every angle, every side of the coin. And you get that here only at the Lockdown Broncos podcast.